the most insane prison escapes that actually happened. Look, I know what you're thinking. You've probably seen every prison break movie ever made, and you think you know all the crazy ways people have busted out of jail. But trust me when I say the real stories I'm about to tell you are so absolutely bonkers that Hollywood couldn't make this stuff up if they tried. We're talking about escapes so creative, so audacious, and so completely unhinged that they make the Shawshank Redemption look like a casual stroll through the park. Today we're diving into the most mind-bending prison breaks in history, and I'm not talking about the famous ones everyone knows about. These are the stories that somehow slipped through the cracks, the escapes so wild that even the most hardcore true crime junkies have never heard of them. From prisoners who literally painted fruit to look like explosives, to inmates who convinced guards they were undercover FBI agents, this list gets progressively more insane as we go on. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. According to recent data, there are over 1,000 escape incidents across the United States every year. That's right, 1,000. Yet somehow, 90% of these escapees get caught within just a few days. So the question becomes, what about that other 10%? What about the ones who pulled off escapes so brilliant, so perfectly executed, that they managed to stay free for months, years, or in some cases, forever? Before we jump into these absolutely mental stories, I need to make something crystal clear. Everything I'm about to tell you actually happened. These aren't urban legends or conspiracy theories. These are documented cases with police reports, surveillance footage, and witness testimonies. Real people, real prisons, real escapes that defy all logic and reason. Let's start with something that sounds like it came straight out of a cartoon. The year is 1986, and we're in France, where a man named Michel Vaujour is sitting in prison, serving time for attempted murder and armed robbery. Now, Michel has a wife named Nadine, and she loves her husband so much that she's willing to do literally anything to get him out. But here's where it gets absolutely ridiculous. Nadine decides the best way to spring her man is to learn how to fly a helicopter. Not kidding. This woman actually enrolled in helicopter flying lessons specifically to break her husband out of prison. Meanwhile, Michel is working on his end of the plan from inside the prison walls. The problem is, you can't exactly walk up to the prison roof without a good reason. Guards tend to notice when inmates start wandering around restricted areas. So Michel comes up with a solution that's so absurd, it actually worked. He gets his hands on some nectarines and dark green paint. You see where this is going, right? He paints these pieces of fruit to look like fake hand grenades. On the day of the escape, Michel walks up to the guards, shows them his fake fruit grenades, and threatens to cause chaos unless they let him onto the roof. The guards, believing these painted nectarines are actual explosives, escort him right to where he needs to be. And right on schedule, here comes Nadine in her helicopter, landing on the prison roof like some kind of action movie hero. Michel hops in, and they fly off into the sunset, leaving behind a bunch of very confused prison guards and some painted fruit. But that's just the beginning. Michel and Nadine's story doesn't end there, and it gets even crazier. After their successful helicopter escape, Michel couldn't stay out of trouble. A few years later, he attempted a bank robbery that went horribly wrong. During the heist, he was injured in the head by police. Most people would consider that the end of the story, right? Wrong. Michel survived the injury and went on to live a relatively normal life. As for Nadine, she was eventually caught and arrested for her role in the helicopter escape, but she became something of a folk hero in France for her dedication to her husband. Now, if you think a helicopter escape using painted fruit is wild, wait until you hear about the guy who convinced an entire prison staff that he was an undercover FBI agent. This is the story of Frank Abagnale, and yes, this is the same guy from the movie Catch Me If You Can. But the real story is even more unbelievable than what Hollywood showed you. Frank was already famous for being one of the most successful con artists in history. By the age of 21, he had successfully impersonated an airline pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and a college professor. But when he finally got caught and thrown in prison, you'd think that would be the end of his con artist career. You'd be wrong. Frank spent weeks in prison carefully studying the guards, learning their routines, their personalities, and most importantly, their insecurities about their jobs. He discovered that the guards were constantly worried about inspections from federal authorities and were always trying to make sure everything looked perfect for when the big bosses came around. So Frank hatched a plan that was so audacious it defies belief. He started dropping hints to the guards that he wasn't really just another prisoner. He began suggesting that he was actually an undercover federal inspector, placed in the prison by the FBI to evaluate the facility's security and the performance of the staff. At first, the guards were skeptical, but Frank was a master manipulator, and he knew exactly how to play on their fears and ambitions. He started giving them subtle compliments about how professional they looked and how well they were doing their jobs. Then he began offering helpful suggestions about prison procedures, speaking with the authority of someone who supposedly knew federal regulations inside and out. The brilliant part of Frank's plan was that he didn't rush it. He spent weeks building up this elaborate fiction, slowly gaining the trust of the prison staff. He would casually mention things like federal inspection protocols and hint that his report back to Washington would determine whether guards got promotions or faced disciplinary action. But here's where Frank's plan gets absolutely diabolical. He had an accomplice on the outside who was helping sell the story. This accomplice somehow managed to forge official-looking FBI credentials and business cards, identifying Frank as a federal inspector. The accomplice then called the prison, claiming to be Frank's superior, and confirmed that there was indeed an undercover operation taking place. The guards were now completely convinced they were dealing with a legitimate federal agent. They started giving Frank special treatment, bringing him better food, allowing him more privileges, and most importantly, treating him like he was their boss rather than their prisoner. Frank played his role perfectly, acting like he was carefully observing everything and taking mental notes for his supposed report. After months of this elaborate charade, Frank simply walked out the front door. The guards, believing he was completing his undercover assignment, didn't stop him. They actually helped him leave, thinking they were assisting a federal inspector who was wrapping up his evaluation of their facility. It wasn't until hours later that anyone realized what had happened, and by then, Frank was long gone. But even Frank's incredible con job pales in comparison to what happened at a jail in California just a few years ago. Two convicted individuals named Samuel Fonseca and Jonathan Salazar pulled off an escape that sounds like something out of a Three Stooges movie, except it actually worked. These guys were being held at the Monterey County Jail, which you'd think would have pretty decent security. The jail had cameras, guards, regular head counts, the whole 9 yards. But Samuel and Jonathan discovered something that the prison architects had apparently overlooked. In the communal bathroom, there was a blind spot where the security cameras couldn't see. Now, most people would maybe use this blind spot to have a private conversation or take a nap. But these two decided to use it for something much more ambitious. They got their hands on a hard plastic cleaning brush, the kind used for scrubbing floors. Then, working only during the brief periods when they could be in the bathroom unsupervised, they started using this brush to knock a hole in the sheetrock ceiling. Think about how long this must have taken. Sheetrock isn't exactly easy to break through, especially when you're trying to do it quietly with nothing but a cleaning brush. They had to work in tiny increments, probably just a few minutes at a time, carefully disposing of the debris so nobody would notice what they were doing. Looking at these absolutely mental stories, you start to realize that truth really is stranger than fiction. From painted nectarines to fake FBI badges, to plastic cleaning brushes, these escapes prove that sometimes the most ridiculous plans are the ones that actually work. The next time you're watching a prison break movie and thinking the plot is too crazy to be real, just remember these stories. Reality doesn't need to make sense to be absolutely insane.